I had always felt an odd pull toward Times Square at night, a lure I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the energy, the endless stream of strangers, or just the lights. But one night, as I wandered aimlessly through the crowd, that vibrant chaos felt strangely different, almost unnatural. There was something in the air, something watching. In the blink of an eye, I noticed a figure staring at me from the other side of the square. Amidst the neon signs and tourists, this person seemed out of place, motionless, shrouded in shadows. My gut tightened, but I dismissed it as paranoia. Yet, as I continued to move, the figure remained and followed. I quickened my pace, weaving through groups of people. Yet every time I looked back, the figure was closer, drifting through the crowd like a ghost. I couldn't make out their face, but their silhouette seemed wrong. I told myself it was just some prank, maybe an actor, but the way they moved was far from human. Every time I blinked, they seemed to be in a new spot, always closer than before. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. Turning around, I found no one. But when I faced forward, there it was. The figure, just feet away, with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. In a panic, I darted into a nearby alley. As I caught my breath, I thought I'd lost them, but the shadow appeared at the entrance of the alley, standing under a dim, flickering light. "What do you want?" I yelled, but it didn't respond. It simply stood there, head tilted, as if studying me. I could hear faint whispers around me, but no one else was there. My heartbeat was deafening. I could see flashes of memories, bizarre and disturbing, like they weren't my own, but somehow planted in my mind by that thing. Desperate, I ran out of the alley, rejoining the bustling crowd. I thought I could hide within the masses, but it was as if everyone around me couldn't see the figure that stalked me. My surroundings felt distorted, almost dreamlike. It was like being stuck in a nightmare where I was the only one aware of the danger. I tried to call for help, but no one seemed to hear me. Their faces all seemed blank, eyes glazed as if under some kind of trance. A man brushed past me, and for a second, I thought I saw that same hollow stare on his face too. He turned back, smirking, as if sharing some dark secret. Panic gripped me. I dashed toward the subway, figuring I could escape underground. But as the train approached, the lights began flickering, and there it was again, that same silhouette waiting on the platform. I jumped into the train as soon as the doors opened, but the car was empty. I felt a chill as the doors closed and the train lurched forward, the lights dimming even further. I looked out the window, seeing reflections of passengers who weren't actually there, ghostly figures that stared back at me with hollow, empty eyes. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't alone in the car. That figure had somehow followed me, standing at the far end, motionless yet edging closer with each flicker of light. The train screeched to a halt in a darkened tunnel, and I felt trapped. I closed my eyes, praying it was all a twisted nightmare. But when I opened them, the figure was right in front of me. As the train's lights flickered back on, it whispered my name, a sound that seemed to come from within my own mind. Then, in an instant, it vanished, leaving only an eerie, chilling silence in its wake. As the train finally pulled into a station, I stumbled out, gasping for air, feeling like I'd just escaped some twisted alternate reality. The bustling energy of Times Square was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet, as if I'd crossed some boundary that night and couldn't return. Since then, I've avoided Times Square after dark, but sometimes I feel its presence lurking in my dreams, waiting. I still hear whispers echoing in the shadows, as if it's never truly left. As if it's still watching, waiting for me to return. Late one evening, I found myself lost in the electric chaos of Times Square, swallowed by the neon glow and endless sea of people. It was loud, chaotic, and full of life, a stark contrast to the gnawing sense of unease rising within me. Somehow, I felt exposed, as if I were being watched. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed a tall figure standing motionless amid the throngs of tourists. Dressed in an old-fashioned black coat and wide-brimmed hat, he didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze was fixed on me, piercing through the crowd like a beacon of darkness. At first I brushed it off, thinking he was just another eccentric New Yorker. But something about his presence felt wrong. He didn't move, didn't shift his gaze, almost like a statue hidden in plain sight. I quickened my pace, trying to blend into the crowd. But no matter how far I walked, I felt that cold, steady gaze boring into my back, like he was reading every thought in my mind. When I finally turned around, he had vanished. But then I spotted him again, closer this time, standing under a flickering street lamp. He tilted his head, as if inviting me to come closer. My stomach twisted with a sense of dread. I wove my way through the crowd, keeping an eye on his every movement, but each time I looked back, he was closer, closing the distance like a predator. Ducking into a narrow side street, I caught my breath, hoping I'd lost him. But I was wrong. There he was, standing at the end of the alley, his eyes glinting with a strange light. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shout for help, but the words caught in my throat as I realized no one was nearby. It was just him and me, alone in the silence of the alley. I forced myself to walk away, but when I emerged back onto the main street, everything felt surreal, as if I'd stepped into a distorted reality. People moved in slow motion, their faces blank and expressionless. The figure appeared again, this time closer than ever, and I realized he wasn't just following me. He was guiding me somewhere, forcing me down unknown paths. Panic set in as I found myself near a closed theater. The marquee lights flickered, casting strange shadows across his face. He stood in front of the entrance, beckoning me with a slow wave of his hand. My feet felt heavy, almost as if they were moving on their own. I was drawn to him, compelled by an invisible force. I tried to fight it, but it was like my body wasn't responding to my commands. The closer I got, the more intense the feeling became. The air around me seemed to hum with energy, and my vision blurred as though I were stepping into another world. When I reached him, he didn't speak. He simply stood there, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but I could feel his gaze on me, even if I couldn't see his eyes. It was as if he were peering directly into my soul. The temperature dropped sharply, and a wave of nausea hit me. My head spun, and I stumbled backward, desperate to escape. But every time I moved, it felt like the world around me was shifting, bending, forcing me back toward him. Suddenly, he reached out with a long, bony hand, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. My heart raced as the strange whispers from earlier returned, growing louder, chanting my name over and over again. I finally broke free, tearing myself away from his grasp. But as I looked back, he was no longer standing in front of the theater. Instead, he was on top of a nearby building, watching me with the same unnerving intensity, his figure now larger, almost monstrous. I ran, not caring where I was going. All that mattered was escaping his unyielding presence. As I darted through the streets, I could feel him behind me, never closing the gap, but never truly disappearing. His eyes were always there, watching, waiting. I managed to find refuge in a crowded bar, my hands trembling as I ordered a drink. I told myself it was all just a hallucination, the stress of the city finally getting to me. But every time I glanced at the door, I swore I saw his shadow lurking outside, just beyond the threshold, waiting for me to leave. Now, whenever I walk through Times Square at night, I feel that familiar pull in my gut, the sense that something is out there, watching me. And sometimes, in the reflection of the glowing billboards, I swear I can see his figure lurking in the crowds, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I was a tourist, only in New York for the weekend, soaking in the sights and sounds of Times Square at night. The buzzing energy of the place was intoxicating, but that night, it felt different. The lights seemed too bright, the crowds too dense. As I walked through the mass of people, something felt off, like I wasn't really alone, even though I was surrounded by hundreds. That's when I heard it, a soft, indistinct whisper, as though someone was speaking just behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I thought it was just the noise of the city playing tricks on me, until it happened again. I froze, my heart racing. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Turn around!" The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't someone in the crowd, it was directed at me. But as I spun around, there was still no one there, only the bustling tourists walking past. My skin prickled with unease. I pushed through the crowd, trying to shake the feeling of being followed, but every step I took, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. "Turn around! Now!" I quickened my pace, trying to leave the strange voice behind, but as I neared the center of the square, the crowd seemed to thin out. The once vibrant streets felt oddly deserted, as if everyone had simply vanished into thin air. It was then that I saw him, a man standing still under a flickering streetlight at the edge of the square. His face was obscured by the brim of a weathered hat, but his posture was unnaturally stiff, rigid as though he were waiting. The whispers came again, now clearly from him. "You're not meant to be here." My pulse quickened, and I instinctively took a step back. But before I could turn and run, he spoke again, his voice cold and detached. "The city remembers." Panic set in. The streets that had once seemed so familiar now felt alien, almost dreamlike. The sounds of the crowd around me blurred into a muffled hum, and every face I passed seemed to look right through me, as though I didn't belong. I decided to leave to find safety away from whatever this man was, but the further I walked, the more the crowd seemed to fade, and the neon lights flickered unnervingly. I felt like I was walking through a distorted version of Times Square, one that wasn't quite real. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see him, a shadow in the corner of my vision, moving with me. No matter how fast I walked, he never seemed to be far behind, always staying just out of sight, as if he were watching me, waiting for something. I took a sudden turn down a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of alleyways. But when I emerged onto a different street, I found myself back in the heart of Times Square, as if the city had swallowed me whole. The man was standing ahead, closer now, his eyes hidden in the darkness under his hat. But this time, I noticed something horrifying. He was no longer standing still. He was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward me. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now harsh like a whispering wind. The world around me began to twist, the lights above flickering and warping. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, as though the city itself were alive, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I tried to move, but it felt like I was wading through thick fog, each step heavier than the last. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the crowd had completely disappeared. Times Square, the beating heart of New York City, was now silent, empty, like a forgotten dream. And the man, he was closer, his outstretched hand reaching for me. My instinct screamed for me to run, but it was as if my body refused to listen. I stumbled backward, trying to escape, but the man was relentless, his presence growing stronger, his whispers growing louder. "The city remembers you," he repeated, his voice now an eerie chant. "You can never leave. You're part of it now." My mind began to reel, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. In a final, desperate attempt, I closed my eyes and pushed forward, trying to escape the nightmare. When I opened them again, I was standing in the middle of Times Square, surrounded by people, just as I had been before. But something was wrong. I felt different, disconnected. And as I looked around, I saw the man's shadow lingering in the crowd, watching me. I quickly left the square, unable to shake the feeling that something had changed within me. It wasn't just the city I had walked through. It was like I had crossed into some other realm, one where the boundaries of time and reality no longer mattered. To this day, whenever I walk through Times Square, I get a strange sense of déjà vu, as if the city itself recognizes me. And sometimes, just as the crowds move past me, I catch a glimpse of him, standing in the shadows, waiting for me to turn around again.